Coming up about 6 minutes after 7 o'clock in Trinidad and Tobago. Good to have you with us as we continue into the second hour of morning edition on this Tuesday. Quite a bit of rain around. Just be mindful of that as you're on the move this morning. And we are safely undercover, as is Ramkumar Narayan Singh, as we return to our discussion with him. He is the Managing Director of RN SYZYGY Employment Relations Limited. You can find them on Facebook as well at RN SYZYGY. And you can also call 295-5441 if you require further information. And indeed, just finishing up on the point that we had our discussion on before we pause for the news, Ramkumar Narayan Singh, before we move on to the whole issue of a discussion of a broader policy in relation to the discussion. How would you like to conclude that element of our discussion?
Firstly, I want to remind employers and employees in Trinidad and Tobago that we have the option of social dialogue all the time in the workplace. Employers, there are a number of options that you can explore if you're faced with having an employee who is subjected to quarantine. And I'm being specific here, not quarantine where the employee is sick. If the employee is sick, allow sick leave benefits to roll in and follow that normal process for applying sick. In regards to an employee who is suspected of being sick, who is not sick but suspected of being sick, and as a consequence, the CMO has issued a quarantine order, or even if you have an employee who has decided a secondary contact that they would prefer to stay at home because of their concerns that they may be sick. You have to, we are living in a new age, and now with this COVID-19 part of our day-to-day lives, we have to create the way forward by thinking forward, not thinking about what we used to do in the past and trying to apply to this type of unique scenario. So in that regard, you can consider what work from home arrangements, right? For employees who may not be able to fulfill 100% of their tasks, and as the employer, you may have to separate some tasks. You can consider having a dialogue with the employee for a salary that would be equivalent to the duties that can be performed, right? So there is a balance in that. So work from home arrangements. Two, if you do not have an option for work from home arrangements, if you have the option to allow the employee to apply a portion of his or her vacation leave. Now, I want to be clear, do not force your employees to use their vacation simply because they have to go in quarantine. If the employee requests this as a means of trying to alleviate the loss in earnings, and you are able to do that, I suggest you do a portion of. That's another thing. I do not suggest that you apply all a person's vacation, or employees should not aspire to take all their vacations, because after this is completed, you're still going to want to have some time to rest and reflect at home. Thirdly, unfortunately, you may not have those options, and then you will have no choice but to essentially grant the employee leave without pay. In those instances, I want to be clear, you cannot identify this type of quarantine leave to be absenteeism. It should be ideally approved, but without pay, of course, if you cannot afford, if you cannot provide any type of social support, etc., etc. At the end of it all, I want to urge all parties, employees and employers, to maintain communication, maintain a discussion. You do not need a third party or anybody for that matter coming from outside of your work environment to come and sit down with you to really solve these problems. These are basic things that you can discuss amongst yourselves and come to a reasonable understanding. And reasonable being the key and operative word in these discussions. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Sir.
Yes, and I know there are a number of different areas. Time obviously that wouldn't allow us to go into great detail into everything, but the whole issue of a policy, developing a policy moving forward in this era now where COVID-19 is going to be part of the landscape for quite some time. What sort of policy are we talking about? Virus prevention policy, employee relations policy? What are we talking about here?
Because I want to urge people to really move past just thinking linear. Stop thinking only about COVID. Remember that we have a number of other viral illnesses in Trinidad and Tobago which have symptoms that are similar to COVID. So now we have to start to think about all communicable viruses in the same light. Therefore, I am urging, it's my recommendation, I have implemented it in a number of companies across the country. We have instituted what is called communicable virus prevention policy. And it applies to a number of different factors. One, you should, as an employer, you should ideally identify to your employee what is a communicable virus. And of course, as we know, it's anything that you have flu-like symptoms that can be easily spread through contact. Of course, you need to explain to your employees, and I know we have pressed for time, but you should explain to your employees why you have this policy. You should also explain to employees what are the practices that you expect and require. And of course, as you know, mask wearing, basic sanitation practices, you may have body temperature check. Some companies are instituting a process of signing in so that if there is a contact tracing protocol, they can help the CMO's office with that process. We also want to encourage people to more or less guide their staff on how they're going to treat with people who are sick and people who are quarantined under this communicable virus process. Clarify your commitment as an employer to your employees, and finally, make sure and give them an avenue to communicate with you, not just leave it up to, hearsay. Maybe you have an email system set up, maybe you have a social media system set up, whatever it may be. When you create these policies, ideally, I would suggest to employers to have a copy given to the employee in hand and have a copy that the employee signs so that they can put on their file, so you have proof or verification that this was communicated. And lastly, make sure and have a system of continuously reminding your staff about these protocols. That's very important.
And Ramco, another thing, in the couple of minutes that we have left, at the end of the day, it appears to come down to that relationship between employer and employees. And you used the word reasonable a while ago. For what might be reasonable for an employer is totally unreasonable for the workers, or vice versa. Do you get any sense, based on what is happening right now with our changed environment, that there's a greater willingness for employer and employees to work together, or in fact, is it the exact opposite from your own experience?
From my experience, I have seen what unreasonability could do. We have experienced it from both sides. And therefore, the position I've taken in starting this business and pushing this business and exercising this service over the years is to try and foster that concept, that thinking, that ideology of being reasonable. And what I always say to parties, both employees and employers, consider the thing that satisfies and secures both parties, the business. Without the business, you're not going to have a job, you're not going to have an income, the employer is not going to have profits, etc., etc. So I always bring them back to the point and the perspective. Whatever action or position you're taking, is it tenable? Is it something that can be sustained for the business, not for yourself, not from a one-sided perspective? And quite often, in conversations with employees and employers, we've found middle ground. Unfortunately, sometimes you have third parties stepping in, and those third parties are thinking from their perspective and not from the perspective inward, outward, from where the business stands. And you always have these contentions come up and go all over the place. And as well, you have employers who act unreasonably. We have to be realistic. And they do not take into consideration the balance of that relationship with their employees, having transparency in what you're doing in the business. And we do end up with contentions. But my position from where I sit, the solution to the issue that we have, the dilemma that we are facing, this potential debilitating factor that can impact on all businesses across Trinidad and Tobago, my view is that if we act rationally and reasonably and consider all things from a general perspective, and what we don't consider, have the other party should remind us and inform us. I think we're gonna survive this. That is my view on this thing. In closing, I'm kind of surprised, honestly, that the government hasn't taken a position to issue, as advice to Trinidad and Tobago's employee business, some standard coming from OSHA or the Ministry of Labour, a standard policy that employers can use. Not everybody can afford to pay for consultation and that kind of thing. So I'm surprised that hasn't happened, but if somebody needs one, feel free to reach out to me and I will be all willing to give you one.
That's
All
a
right.
good sales pitch as well, Ram Kumar Narayan Singh, very much in the corporate world now from the days of union representation and so on. But thanks very much for taking the time to speak with us as well, Ram Kumar Narayan Singh of our